Hello everybody, welcome back to Buckeye Readers Chat. I'm Nicole.
I'm Krista.
And today we're going to talk about books that are based around historical events. And this was a really interesting one, I think, for both of us, because we found some books that we weren't familiar with, and we found events that we weren't familiar with.
So true.
Actually, my first one I was a little bit familiar with, but I was really excited about this one. So my first one is called In the Garden of Spite, and this is about a woman named Belle Gunness. She was one of the most prolific female serial killers in history. She was a Norwegian-American woman who had her own farm, and what she would do is she would put out an ad in the paper for men who had money, and she wanted to combine her money and her farm and get married. And so she would entice the men to come to her farm, and she would get the money, and then the men would no longer be around. So she was active from 1884 to 1908.
It's a long time.
It was, it was a really long time. She was said to have killed up to 14 men, but they actually believe it was probably much higher, somewhere closer to 40 men. Actually 40 individuals that died by her hand, but they don't necessarily have proof on all of those. They also say that she died in a fire in 1908, but there's a lot of speculation that she faked her own death. So she may have actually lived much longer than that. We don't know for sure.
It's interesting how 40 plus men could go missing.
Right, yeah. And you know, for that time period, and again, I'm not condoning what she did, but it's very fascinating that a woman in that age was able to take charge of her life in that way.
Own property.
And own a property, and I'm sure these men thought that they were getting the best deal out there, but didn't have any idea it was really coming along with it. So what books do you have? Or
one of the books that caught my attention is The Nickel Boys.
Mm-hmm.
Nickel Boys is a 2019 novel based upon a real story of the Dossier School in Florida that was a reform school for young boys. Sad part is that the children were being abused, the boys were being abused. It's a fictionalized version. And the school opened in 1900s and closed in 2011. The state of Florida ran Dossier as a reform school, and then they come to find out as an investigation entails, and I won't take you through, I want to leave a little bit of suspense, but they found that not only the boys, but the guards and the employees, Florida law enforcement found out there was a lot of murders going on, but unfortunately it took 111 years before that school was torn down or closed.
That's really rough.
Really, really sad. I don't want to give it all away, but it's a hard read, in the sense it's disturbing, but it's a piece of history.
Right.
It's a piece of history. It happened back in the 1900s, and it was at the time of a lot of stuff was going on, and a lot of racism was happening at the same time.
So, unfortunately, a lot of our stories, a lot of the historical events were not based in happy moments. My next one is called Salt to the Sea, and this one is based in World War II, again, in not a very happy moment in our time. This one is set in 1945. The fascinating event that it is related to that I knew very little about, the story is about 4 teens who were escaping East Prussia, and they board a ship called the MV Wilhelm Gustloff, and I apologize if I'm not saying that correctly. It was a German military transport that really did exist, and it was sunk in 1945 by a Soviet submarine. It was transporting civilian refugees and military personnel, and it was said that 9,400 people died on that ship. It was the largest loss of life in a single ship sinking. So it was a very tragic event. Another related historical event that they bring up in the book was the Amber Room, which I knew nothing about. But in case you don't know what the Amber Room is, it was a chamber that was decorated in amber panels backed by gold leaf and mirror, so it was absolutely gorgeous. It was located in the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg, and it was constructed in the 18th century in Prussia, but the room was dismantled and eventually disappeared during World War II, so nobody ever found out where it was, or if they did, they're not telling anybody. But it was considered the 8th wonder of the world. So, I mean,
Did not know that.
Yeah, so I'm really curious to see how they bring it up in the book, but it's very fascinating. So what's your next book?
My next book is Girl Waits with the Gun, historical fiction. It's based upon actually the woman Constance Cobb, a true story that in the early 1900s she became the first female sheriff in the United States. And so basically, as the story goes, the Cobb sisters, it was her and several of her sisters, they found themselves butting heads with the factory owner, Henry Kaufman, who crashed his car into their buggy. And when they went after him for money, he started retaliating and coming back with them at them to get their farm. And so he had law enforcement at his hands, and so they did what they had to do and defend their farm. I'm not going to give away the whole story, but it's a really good book, and in the fact that it's just heartening to see, and unfortunately back in the early 1900s, the women were being bullied by a man that was in power, and that to myself is a significance. And then you look at 1914, we're talking about World War I and various different things going on. So it's a good read. It's the first book in the series, the whole series, so it's definitely worth checking out. And then the thing I just want to remind everybody, we do have it available in large print.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, I think that's what's interesting about fictional books that are set in historical events, historical fiction, is that they're, you could get a book that talks about World War II and talks about the events of things, but you can now relate to these stories from the perspective of your character, and because they have to keep true to these events that happened, they can't just do whatever they want in these stories. They do have to keep these characters and the plot in line with what was going on at that time. So I think that's what makes historical fiction very fascinating. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We'll see you next time on Buckeye Readers Chat. Bye.